pulling all this together. As you said, I'm Martin Hsia. I know a lot of you folks. Good to see some familiar faces, people I know through the community. And for those I haven't met yet, apologies to be meeting under these pretenses where you're going to have to hear me talking for an hour. So maybe we'll get to know each other another time. You notice I talk a lot. I talk a lot and I talk fast when I'm presenting. That's for a number of reasons, which I realized over time is largely because I present on topics that I get really excited about, because this is something that I do a lot of work with. Also, that's to hopefully keep it entertaining and engaging. It's 9 o'clock in the morning on Friday. I don't want anyone else to, I want people to get something out of this. So we got to keep it interesting. And that's also so that I don't get bored listening to myself talk. And maybe a little part of it is just to manage my own anxiety presenting in front of other people. But all that to say is I'm going to go fast. I'm going to be covering a lot of things here. May not get to everything, but I'll do the best I can. If people have questions, you can kind of jump in here. But I'll try to allow some time at the end to make sure we get on time to Mervin's talk. So with that said, we named this presentation Treatment for Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder and Mental Rumination, the Newest Trends and Developments, which that's all good and fun for, this conference's purposes. Sounds very professional and scholarly and academic, but for funsies, I came up also just kind of for our purposes, a kind of an alternative title, which is Mind Wars. Where is it? A New Hope. An Introduction to Inference-Based CBT. Is that audio coming through?
Yes.
Okay, all right. No one's ever heard that before, so it's new. Anyway, all right. I got a little carried away with the slides here, but just to kind of keep it interesting. Quick audience participation. I'd love everyone to take 10, 15 seconds and I want you to think of a film, a TV show, or a book that could be recent or something you've seen a long time ago that you recall just totally captivated your attention and just sucked you in, that you were just so into it that you lost track of time, forgot where you were. Think of one or two things and punch it into the group chat for a second. Take 10, 15 seconds to do that.
While we're doing that, Martin, I think you were asking about the sound that's you may have been playing a sound effect.
Yeah, did it not come through?
I didn't hear it.
Oh, well, it was a Star Wars theme just for okay. Funsies, like I said, but whatever. Everyone can hear it because everyone knows it, but okay. All right, got some great answers here. Everyone punching something. If you can't think of anything now, that's all right, but we'll come back to it and I'll tell you why. Okay, so once again, we are here to talk about, what's been the existing treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder and what are the emerging trends. How many folks have heard of exposure with response prevention? Just quick show of hands. Yeah, okay. Exposure with response prevention, ERP, that's been the traditional model for working with OCD, what we call the gold standard in the therapy world. And then we're also going to talk about the emerging sort of metacognitive ways of understanding and treating OCD. I already gave away the punchline. We call it ICBT, or inference-based cognitive behavior therapy. And I hope by the end of this hour to at least have introduced you folks to some of the new concepts, language, and tools that ICBT is bringing to us in the OCD specialist community. This is not going to be an in-depth training on how to do it all. Obviously, that's much more involved, but in an hour, I can at least hopefully give an introduction, and we can compare and contrast different ways of conceptualizing and working with OCD. Oops. Okay. So most people, at least, even if it's not something you work a lot with or have ever dealt with personally, are familiar with some common presentations of OCD: contamination fears, excessive hand washing, disinfecting, unwanted thoughts about safety. Did I hit someone with my car and not realize it and got to drive around the block to double check? Unwanted thoughts of violence or harming oneself, somebody else, somebody vulnerable, minors. We've seen some really just heartbreaking cases, people who are educators, work with kids with special needs that start having unwanted, intrusive thoughts of, molesting kids. What do I do with that? It's just so much shame, so much anxiety. People questioning their sexual orientation, and not in a way of sort of exploring or emerging, but sort of like, no, this is always who I've been, and I'm in this same-sex relationship. Why am I questioning whether I am actually this, or vice versa, right? people questioning, like all of a sudden, their relationship. I've been married to the same person for 40 years, relatively happily, and then all of a sudden I just had this thought of attraction to this other. What does that mean? Am I with the wrong person, right? Morality. What if I just had a random urge to say some really offensive, racist thing in front of 35 colleagues? And all sorts of other examples you can imagine. Health and illness, anxiety, right? We've seen people with like 12 ER visits and 7 different cardiology consults before they finally okay, everyone's telling me the same thing, which is everything checks out fine. I'm just really anxious. And then they sort of end up, with us. So really important point to make with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, obsessions, colloquially, when we hear the word obsession, that sounds like an infatuation, like, my daughter's obsessed with this new boy who joined the class, or so-and-so's obsessed with the new Taylor Swift album, right? That sounds like a positive thing, an infatuation. That's not at all what we're talking about when we say obsessions with OCD, and it's a really important distinction to make. What we mean by obsessions, and this is an old evolution of the word from the old psychoanalytic world, is that it's all we're talking about is thoughts, images, sort of mental stimuli, or things that bring about the discomfort, the anxiety, they're unwanted. That's all we mean by obsession when we're talking about obsessive compulsive disorder. Similarly, compulsions, the compulsions piece is, sometimes we hear, my daughter is a compulsive liar, or so-and-so has a compulsive shopping problem. That makes it sound like compulsions are just kind of bad habits. But compulsions and OCD, that's not what we're talking about either. Compulsion is simply something that we do in response to the obsession. Most familiarly, people are aware of sort of checking or washing compulsions, ordering, doing things in very prescribed, ritualistic, elaborate ways. Sometimes reassurance seeking. A little boy says, "Mommy, I had this, I noticed my teacher's butt the other day. I'm a good boy, right?" And she says, "Of course. What? You're such a good boy." And he says, "Oh, okay, good, thanks." But what happens? He might have to do that again. Avoidance, right? If I had unwanted thoughts about what I could do to minors, I better, I'm not going to be around kids at all. I'm going to go to the playgrounds, parks, school, forget it. I'm going to put a restraining order on myself. And then we talk about sort of more covert compulsions, right? Just mental ruminating, saying things, repeating things, mental counting, safety behavior, self-testing. These are kind of common types of compulsions. And again, a compulsion with OCD, all that means is that is something we're doing to prevent or reduce the distress caused by the obsession. That's it. That's all we mean by compulsion when it comes to OCD. Now, whoops. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Exposure with response prevention. I mentioned that earlier. ERP. That has been the gold standard, we call it, treatment for OCD for decades. That's not just what we believe, that's what we knew. That's what we did in the OCD world. And exposure arises, or rather sort of originated in the sort of behavioral language and the behavioral treatments and research, 50s and 60s. And the idea, right, with phobias, right, if you have a phobia of spiders, dogs, needles, heights, right, is what's the most natural thing to do if something like that causes anxiety? Pleasure pain principle, we want to avoid it, right? But we all know when you avoid something, what happens, it feels reinforcing and we just want to avoid it more and more, and it grows bigger and bigger in our heads, right? The idea with exposure is the opposite. We got to kind of start to confront it again. And as maybe we all learned in, CBT 101 is, habituation, right? The idea of when you confront something, it's going to be uncomfortable if you've been avoiding it and if it creates anxiety. But the longer you stay with it, as long as we are maybe repeating it and not escaping from it, there's some anxiety, but then it's going to come down over time. That's habituation. It's our nervous system sort of getting used to something, just like when you get in a pool and it's kind of cold. First, it's really cold, but then your body adjusts to it, right? And that was sort of the original idea with the exposure model. Over time, as the evolution with CBT, right, there's sort of this idea of what we call inhibitory learning, which is what happens when we confront something that's been creating anxiety for us isn't just that our body and nervous system adjust, but we're also, between these years, learning something different through that exposure, through that new experience. For example, if part of the reason I've been avoiding, being around heights or balconies is I just have this unwanted, like, what if I had a random impulse to jump off or lost my balance? I'd better just stay away from it just in case, right? So I avoid it. But if we can work with someone to sort of say, well, how close can we get to it, or work towards some sort of exposure there and not avoiding anymore, maybe they'll get used to it physiologically in the habituation sense, but maybe they'll also learn something new, which is one thing. Maybe that thing that they're afraid of happening doesn't actually happen. Don't actually just have a random impulse to jump. And secondly, whatever anxiety they thought was so uncomfortable, so intolerable that led them to avoid for however many years, they realize, oh, maybe that anxiety is not as bad as I thought. Maybe I can actually tolerate it if I do it systematically and in a certain way. And so what happens is two expectations that they had that were underlying the anxiety are now getting violated through that exposure, and they're learning something new. That's inhibitory learning. So there's a behavioral physiological way of thinking about it, as well as a cognitive piece. Now, that's sort of thinking about phobias and exposure. With OCD, it's a little bit different because we know that there's all these sort of the rituals and the rumination, and it just gets people into all sorts of loops and weird places that are kind of unique to OCD versus, say, phobias or something else. And so that's where the RP piece comes in, the response prevention, because the compulsions are a unique piece of OCD. With phobias, it may be more, in general, more just avoidance without sort of the ruminating or the very arbitrary rituals. With OCD, that's sort of a unique feature. And so we have to try to trim that back. We've got to kind of eliminate that, because what we find is if we do exposure for OCD, but we don't eliminate the compulsions, we don't get the result we want. We don't get the habituation, we don't get inhibitory learning, and so nothing really changes. Yeah. Okay. So this is a quick review. Some of you are familiar with this, so if it's a quick review, if this is new to you folks, it's just a very brief overview of ERP. Basically, the E, the exposure piece, is targeting the O, the obsession, the source of anxiety. And again, it's just the opposite of avoidance is to confront something. We could do that live in vivo with actually confronting specific real world triggers, or sometimes if that's not feasible or not comfortable yet, we do what they call imaginal exposures, sort of confronting them through visualization or imagery. But also, of course, there is the RP piece, the response prevention. So it's sort of a shield that blocks, and we've got to try to trim back and work towards eliminating the compulsions, both overt and covert, reassurance seeking, safety behaviors, all that stuff. Otherwise, again, we're not going to get where we want to go and reduce the distress. Yeah. So, a long story short, exposure, the E is for the O, for the obsession. The RP is targeting the compulsions. We're exposing the fear, we're confronting it, we're preventing the escape of the anxiety with eliminating the compulsions. And if we can do that successfully, we're going to reduce the D, the disorder aspect of OCD. Now, ERP, so that's, like I said, that's been what we've done for years. That was unquestioned, that was the gold standard. And research tells us that ERP is successful for OCD in 50% of cases. That's a lot. That has, been life-changing, dare I say, life-saving for many severe OCD sufferers. That's great. However, what about the remaining 50%? What about the people for whom it wasn't effective, or for whom ERP, dare I say, maybe exacerbated their symptoms? What about people who are, look, the idea of doing exposure, does that sound comfortable if you've been avoiding something? No. A lot of people are like, nah, no thanks, I'm good. I don't want to do that, right? It's a tough sell, yeah? Or some people are just like, I'm game in theory, but I just cannot tolerate doing exposure. Okay, so what do we do? Is that it? What about people that have more internal and mental rumination rather than sort of, concrete compulsion? Yeah. So that's where we pivot to ICBT. I call it the new kid on the block, inference-based CBT. But in reality, this has been in development for over 20 years, since the early 2000s. Dr. Fred Ardema and the late Kieran O'Connor, they're the researchers largely behind developing the model out of the University of Montreal. And so it's been in development. There's been research, there's been theory, all sorts of academic work around this. However, even though it's been going on for 20 years, it really has only started to gain traction among the OCD specialist community in the last 4 or 5 years. And it's really, really taken off. And I don't know you folks, but it's really interesting. Like anytime you see like, this is the way we've done it, and then here comes a new idea, there's a real interesting range of responses that I've seen among my colleagues in the OCD world to that. Some people are like, oh, that's interesting. Let me learn more about that. And then there's people who say, yeah, I think I do that already. That's not really nothing new about that. Whatever, fair enough. Just the same old thing dressed up in different language. And then there's other people who say like, yeah, sure. Okay, yeah, sure. Whatever. Nothing new under the sun. Let's wait to see more research, and then much more, sort of dismissive of it. But I will tell you just anecdotally in our practice, really kind of keeping an open mind and embracing and working in some of the tools, language, and aspects of ICBT has radically transformed what we do and how we think about OCD in our world. And we do a lot of that. So it's not to say everything else that we know that I mentioned before is off the table. It's just, really given us a lot more complex, sophisticated language, tools, and I think a lot more options to work with people suffering, which is great. So the mechanism here is different. ICBT says, okay, this is not just about anxiety. That's not the primary thing. It's not just an anxiety disorder and avoiding, and we just got to confront it, right? It's not just a two-front war, East and the West, and we sandwich the kind of enemy in the middle and take away real estate. There is something very deeply, richly cognitive happening. It's a faulty reasoning process. Why is it called inference-based cognitive behavior therapy, by the way? Is because something is being inferred. It's an error of inference. Someone is seeing one thing or not seeing anything and inferring something incorrect based on that. And it's not just the fact that the thing that they're being inferred is incorrect, it's that process by which that happens is a leap. Not a leap of faith, it's a leap of doubt. And that's what starts this whole process of OCD. I'll get into a lot more in detail. But the term that we'll talk about is called inferential confusion. It's like I look at the lock, I just turned it, I see it, I felt it, I heard it, it's locked. And some part of me says, well, what if it's not? It's an error of inference. I'm inferring something that leads down the path of doubt, and everything ensues from there. So the anxiety that I feel, that's not the primary issue. The anxiety is actually secondary to that original doubt that is given birth to by a mental process and inferential confusion and that error of inference. Another important thing to say, in the ERP world, we talk about when you do exposure, we're learning to tolerate uncertainty, right? That there might be germs on there, that the door might be locked, that you might become a serial murderer someday, or that you might be with the wrong person. Probably not, but maybe not. We're tolerating uncertainty. ICBT says, no, this is not about uncertainty. It's about doubt. Uncertainty means you don't have information, so it's not clear. You don't know what's going to happen. Doubt is about, no, you have information. You have facts. You have an experience. You have logic. You have your senses. You're just doubting whether those things are real or whether they're accurate, right? Which I think is a really compelling difference here. Yeah. So you see how that's a little bit different from a phobic model of just it's anxiety, avoid it. There's just a lot more layers to it. This sticking with the Mind Wars, Star Wars theme here, if anyone will recognize Senator Palpatine from Star Wars, right? And sometimes in the ICBD world, we talk about how OCD is like a con man. It likes to say, hey, Anakin, you sure the Jedi, do they really recognize how powerful you are? I mean, I can help you out, but, it's subtle. He likes to make it sound like he's protecting you. He's got your back. He's on your side. But over time, we kind of know what happens, right? He's two-faced. He's manipulating. Doesn't actually have your best interest in mind. And OCD is like that. It's like a con man that sort of says, sure, you might want to check. You might just want to check a lock one more time. You might want to just click your car key just for good measure one more time, right? But then it really grows from there, as we know. So inferential confusion, really important concept. That's the core glitch here, according to ICBT, right? It's not anxiety. Anxiety is secondary, but it's when we cross over from reality, which is grounded in our senses, grounded in our present moment logic. I see the stove, it's off. It's off. I don't see anything. I don't smell anything. I don't hear a flame, the knob, right? But we cross over from that into an imagined possibility. Maybe it's actually leaking gas or something. Maybe I'm seeing it wrong. Maybe I'm misremembering, right? So this is not about habituation. This is like, how did we get to that idea in the first place? Why am I doubting what I see, what I hear, my senses? That's the key component here. So it's a glitch, like in the Matrix. The moment you stop trusting your eyes, but we're stuck in our imagination. I see the door's locked. Well, what if it's not? I think it might be open. And we're going to target that reasoning process that creates the doubt. The anxiety, yeah, sure, there's anxiety, and we're not denying that, but that's not the primary thing. That's a secondary feature. Now, let's go back, because I gave you folks the task of naming some shows, movies, books that really sucked you in. So, Outlander. Sorry, Joe, I'll get to your question later. Project Hail Mary, Battlestar Galactica, Breaking Bad. Ooh, my kid's starting watching that again. I don't know if that's age appropriate, but I can't stop them. Indiana Jones, Lost, Fall of the House of Usher. Ooh, the dark one. Usual Suspect. Great, yeah. All right, so now, long story short, like what do all these have in common, right? Is when you're watching a good show or a great movie, you know, or reading a good book, you are sucked out of reality, which, by the way, for most of us is probably not that interesting. You're at your home curled up under a blanket in your PJs and your socks. Okay, whatever, that's fine, you're cozy, great. But in the book, something's happening. Are these two people going to have sex? Is that person going to get caught for that crime? Is that person going to get killed? Or you know what's going to happen? You are drawn in. If you're in the movie theater, right? What's going to happen, right? Is the spaceship going to land, right? We are sucked away from reality, present moment senses, our own, you know, real life troubles, real life joys, whatever happened in session earlier today for us, whatever's going on in real life, we are sucked into our imagination. We are escaping from reality, and that's good writing, right? That's good art, that's good literature, that's a good show, it's good production, directing, acting, editing. That's what it should do, and that's what we want. We need to escape from reality sometimes. That's healthy. But imagine if at the end of, you know, whatever movie, we're still in the movie theater and we're still like everything in the screen is real. That's what OCD is like. Or you stop reading Harry Potter and you're like, whew, oh man, that was intense. Like, you know, I just want to make sure Voldemort's not hiding in the closet, right? Little kids, they have trouble separating imagination from reality. That's why you got to sleep with them a little bit longer, or, you know, they hide under the covers. Hopefully as adults, we can, you know, distinguish that a little bit more. But with OCD, it really blends that. OCD likes to take something that seems reasonable and then inflate it and take all these tools to distort our thoughts and our truth and what we know to be real to make its case and to inflate this whole other story, take us away from, again, reality, senses, and logic into our imagination. That's a key point here, okay? So, you know, for example, again, I mentioned this earlier. Let's say, you know, some of us have been married for many years or in long-term relationships, and yeah, it's not perfect all the time, but for the most part, hopefully, we're generally happy in our relationships. And then you're at Starbucks and there's a barista who's kind of attractive, or you have a coworker and you just have a moment where you feel connected to them, and then you think, oh my gosh, what does that mean? Maybe I actually should be with that person, or maybe I married the wrong person. And then that's how, you know, a relationship type OCD can sort of spiral into and exaggerate and become charged, and the anxiety grows from there, right? It's an initial doubt that leads to a big anxiety later. It creates alarm, a sense of alarm, perceived stakes, high pressure, right? And then we're sucked into it from there. Oh my gosh, I just, you know, my stomach was a little upset the other day. Maybe that's because the doorknob I touched outside Dr. DeSantis's office. Maybe something was on there. My gosh, right? OCD is like our own mental clickbait, right? We're in an attention economy, right? We want more likes, we want more clicks. That's how social media works. OCD sort of like understands that really well. It sort of says, we got to get this person's attention. We got to inflate things. We got to create a sense of alarm, create a sense of doubt. Oh my gosh, doorknobs, germs everywhere, right? Or imagine, oh my gosh, I saw this headline in the local psychologist becomes gang lord. Oh my God, somebody mentioned Breaking Bad. Like, hey, look, it happens. I don't know. And like, oh God, that's terrible. You know, this you'd think, you know, hey, psychologists, good people, you know, they're helping people, right? Why would they? Like, God, like, I'm glad that would never happen to me.
Martin,
It never happened to me.
Martin,
Yeah,
our association has always emphasized community outreach. I just didn't realize it would eventually look like a RICO case.
I should mention, of course, that any resemblance to anybody we know here in our community is just purely coincidental. But this is how it works, right? This is what we call hearsay. It's a little trick, like, hey, did you hear about that psychologist that became gang lord? Yeah, I watched Breaking Bad. Like, yeah, it's not, people aren't what you think. Like, what if that could happen to me? And then we start doubting, and then we go down a rabbit hole. Or, you know, hey, did you see the headline about the guy that drove his Tesla off the cliff? Oh my gosh, that's so tragic, so terrible. Like, oh, well, I drive on a cliff, you know, mountainy road sometime. What if I did that, right? And then things kind of, the spark becomes a fire. Forgive me for using a you know, wildfire analogy, but. Okay, so this is something, again, this is not language or tools or diagrams or visuals that ERP offers us or that we had before. But in the ICBT world, we talk about there's an obsessional sequence. There is an order of events in which things happen, right? Just going about our day in reality, grounded in our logic, our common sense, things make sense, our five senses, facts, real experiences. And then there's triggers. Now, again, trigger has a certain connotation to it from the trauma world, but in OCD, all we're talking about is just things that happen. Random, neutral thoughts, stimuli, things that we see out in the world. But what happens is OCD, that con man, likes to take the trigger and then sow the seeds of doubt. And that inferential confusion takes us down a path that diverges from reality. There's an original obsessional doubt that is not based on any actual facts, senses, or logic. And once we're, to the extent that we're entertaining that, right? Oh my gosh, well, if there's germs on the doorknob, well then, oh my gosh, I might get IBS, I might get sick, I might spread it to someone else, I might be contributing to some pandemic, right? That's the negative consequence, right? And then of course, if there's some negative consequence that's undesirable, I'm gonna feel anxious. I might feel shame, I might feel guilt as well. So number of types of distress. And then as a result, what am I gonna do to kind of soothe that or try to put that to rest, put that fire out? I'm gonna do some sort of compulsion, some sort of maybe ritual that my mind tells me to do. I'm gonna avoid it, seek reassurance, some safety behavior, ruminate about it, right? Now notice here, there is an order of events, right? According to this model, the anxiety is not the first thing. It's sort of, again, follows from the doubt. And the compulsion is way at the end of the sequence. So there would be no need for compulsions if I didn't get hooked on the doubt, right? Triggers can happen all the time for people who aren't dealing with OCD, and we go along the line of reality for the most part, right? But this path is taking us way off the road. And by the time a person gets to compulsion, you know, it's predicated on the previous steps that otherwise aren't the case for somebody else exposed to the same trigger. There's no compulsion without the doubt is the point. The other thing too, the question here, ERP, as I mentioned earlier, exposure and response prevention, where along that sequence, to the extent that that holds up, do you think ERP is targeting? Any particular place along that line?
The anxiety?
Absolutely, yeah. The exposure, we're confronting something that's creating anxiety. So I would say you're right that exposure is confronting the anxiety, and the response prevention,
the compulsion.
earlier, exactly, is targeting the compulsion. So ERP is intervening at the sort of end of that sequence, correct? With ICBT says something different. No, they say, if we can educate people about this whole process, if we can give them tools and language to understand that this is all an illusion, this is all the matrix, this is all a production, and understand the mechanisms and the pieces and be able to describe what's happening, and we can sit back from it and understand it and not be so anxious about it. And so we're less likely to get hooked in the doubt to begin with, because we understand how this OCD thing is trying to hook us. And if we can intervene up there, like I said, if we don't get hooked in the doubt, we'll never get down to the need to have the anxiety or to do the compulsion, right? So from that perspective, we're intervening more cognitively upfront and sort of basically getting rid of the need to do exposure. So that's a different model. We call that intervening upstream rather than downstream, where the ERP is targeting, okay? So once again, just some of this is going to sound like I'm repeating myself, but just to get into a little bit more, right? The primary inference is the error of inference. Maybe the door is open, even though we're all looking at it and it's closed. And the secondary inference, which is the negative consequence that results in anxiety, is like, oh, if it's open, then a burglar could come, right? ERP is targeting further downstream the anxiety. ICBT says, what are we anxious about? If we can resolve the doubt up front, no need to go there. We all know that OCD can be a repetitive trap, a cycle, right? Where, you do the compulsion and you get temporary relief, or it feels helpful, you get reassurance, but then what happens is it grows, and then you got to do that again and again every time something happens, and maybe even gets worse, right? And so it's kind of like a wheel. It's a cycle that goes around and around. I think this is a really powerful analogy. Is we call this the outer wheel of OCD. And notice this is just the obsessional sequence that I just described, mapped onto a circle. There's a trigger in the left-hand side. And then if we get hooked on that doubt, which is really the linchpin piece, then there's going to be some undesirable consequence. I'm going to have anxiety and emotional reaction to stress, and then I have to do a compulsion. But that doesn't end it, right? It's not a line and then we're done. I got to keep doing it around and around. So that's the outer wheel. That's kind of what we know. That's kind of what we see. But underneath that, there's something else happening. There are processes, there are very complex, kind of subtle, veiled mental phenomena that are popping up this process, that are maintaining this flawed reasoning sort of series of events, that are sort of giving birth to and maintaining the strength of the inferential confusion and the preponderance and the likelihood of getting stuck in the doubt. So a real quick overview we'll talk about is the obsessional narrative, which is basically the idea that there's not just an original doubt, like, oh, that, what if I'm actually attracted to that cute barista at Starbucks? It's also like, oh my gosh, then maybe I should leave my spouse of 35 years and be with that person. And then like, oh my God, what am I going to tell the kids? And like, everyone's going to judge me. And like, there's a whole story, right? We can get really, really elaborate. There's obsessional reasoning processes, which is, I mentioned one earlier, like, oh my God, that local psychologist became a gang lord. Like, oh, that's terrible. Like, wait, could that happen to me? That's what we call hearsay, right? It likes to take something over here and sort of say, how do you know, right? Or the guy drove his car off the cliff. Oh, that's terrible. Well, how do I know I wouldn't do that, right? It's important to be, take care of to be conscientious about hygiene. Yeah, sure. Who's going to disagree with that? So I better just wash compulsively until I make sure there's no germs on here. It takes something that sounds good and makes sense, and then twists it and distorts it, and then keeps the wheel going faster and turning with more vigor. Those are the obsessional reasoning processes. And then finally, there's what they call a feared possible self. And that's a little bit different from sort of like the inner child idea of something. It's more the idea that, there's who we are, which again, like I was saying, in real life, most people were regular, ordinary, well-meaning citizens of society, not trying to hurt anybody else. But the feared possible self is the exact opposite of that. What if you're someone who's morally bereft, who could be corrupted, who could be something exactly opposite of what you think you are, who could be violent, right? And that idea starts to get sort of projected as if it's, again, clickbait, and supports this whole process. There's so much to go into, so like I'm going to give a brief introduction. The OCD trifecta, these are aspects of the sort of what I call the obsessional reasoning processes. OCD makes you distrust your senses, as we kind of said earlier. Most of us, like, you look outside, you see your car, you see it's locked, and like, okay, it's locked, whatever. But as we said earlier, we distrust it. And the more we do compulsions, the more we ruminate, the more emotional sort of energy we give to these doubts and to this whole process and give into the story, the more it rubs off our senses and our trust in what we see, what we feel, what we know, our memory, and the what ifs start to feel more and more convincing. Yeah? Boundless imagination. Boy, just, hey, it's possible, that, it's possible that a plane could land on, my house right now. It's possible that there could be another pandemic. It's possible that there could be germs on some of the door. Is it possible? I guess it's possible. But OCD likes to twist that too. Again, turn up the stakes and sort of say like, well, Yeah, I know it's not a high likelihood, but what happens is a very low probability ends up feeling like a high possibility, right? Remote possibility feels like high probability. And then misapplication of logic, irrelevant things, hearsay, stories. I heard something over here. Maybe that applies here. Here's a general principle, and I should never break that. And becomes very rigid. And OCD says, like, are you sure you're being faithful? Because you keep having that thought. Whatever, right? And then the stakes feel high. We feel like we're doing something wrong. We talked about the feared possible self, the vulnerable self. How are we doing on time? Great. Basically, the idea of, if I don't wash, I'm a negligent person. If I have this thought, I actually had this thought about becoming like, what if I became a terrorist or a gang lord? I'm actually, what if that could be true? I'm a secret monster. So we're trying to reconnect the person with actually who they are rather than the person in the story, in the character. But it can get real convincing the more time they've spent in that imaginal story, right? But what we have to convince someone of and help them understand is that the compulsions that they feel are protecting them, all they're doing is they're protecting them from this feared version of themselves, which really has no credibility, right? And so again, it's based on an illusion. It's all trickery. So a really good way to distinguish these, which we'll get into in a second. ICBT or ERP is about that the power comes through confrontation, through exposure, right? ICBT says, what if the most powerful thing is not confrontation, but realization? Realizing that this is all phony. It's a movie. It's a book. It's fiction. Yeah. But it's really good, right? It's really convincing, just like some of the books and references people mention. I realized I didn't do a good job with this slide, but basically the idea is like, again, when we're in OCD mode and when we're really sucked into the bubble, over the bridge, into the story with the wheel turning and in that sequence, our faith, our belief, our trust is so heavily invested in the imaginary and in what's possible, even very remote, seemingly illogical possibilities. And we're so far away from our senses and our reality based in logic and facts. Where we put our trust defines our reality. And by the same token, so this is OCD mode, our goal is to turn this dial back down so that more trust is being reinvested in our senses. If I don't see it, it's not there. If there's no logic to support it, if there's no facts, I've got to trust that and reinvest my, where I put my attention. All right. So I'm gonna run through a couple slides here that really illustrate the differences here, and then maybe we can get to a quick example and then some questions if that sounds all right. Yeah. Okay. So everybody knows Drake here, maybe not, but ERP says, okay, our focus is on concrete behavior change. Rather than avoiding, we're going to confront and we're going to cut back compulsions, right? ICBT says something a little bit different. Like, no, the focus is on something cognitive. It's something less tangible. It's a mental change. It's a flawed reasoning process. That's where the change happens. Okay, important distinction. As I mentioned earlier, ERP says, hey, you got to learn to tolerate uncertainty. And if you keep avoiding, you're never going to learn that you can tolerate it. That's why we have to do exposure. ICBT, as I said earlier, right? These thoughts, it's not uncertain. No, we have certainty. We're just doubting what we already have evidence for. Sensory information, real experience, present moment, logic, common sense, all that stuff. We're doubting. It's not uncertainty. Important difference. ERP says, okay, you're dealing with contamination and you are dealing with unwanted sexual thoughts and you're dealing with blasphemous religious scrupulosity. So for you, we're going to do these exposures, and for you, we're going to do these, and for you, so we're going to target the specific types of OCD. And by the way, if you're one person who's dealing with 2, 3, 4, multiple types, we're going to kind of maybe do them one by one, even if they pop up and do the whack-a-mole type thing. But ICBT says, well, rather than focusing on each specific type, we're going to educate this person who's suffering in the overall sort of metacognitive pattern in which OCD works across subtype, across the different type of obsession. And that way, if someone is dealing with more than one, they can sort of understand that and apply that model to any different type of unwanted thought. ERP says thoughts. You got to be careful talking about thoughts in therapy, right? Because, it's more just, we want to ignore them. We're focused on behavior, right? Thoughts are just noise. And, we just want to focus on not doing rituals and not avoiding, right? And in fact, ERP might often say, we definitely don't want to focus too much on thoughts because we risk kind of colluding with them or trying to disprove them. And that's just, ruminating and getting stuck in the ritual, which is not entirely wrong. But ICPD says, well, I don't know that we can totally ignore the thoughts altogether. We at least have to be able to have some understanding of what the thought processes are. Maybe we don't have to get stuck in the content because we understand that then if we're sort of doing standard, your grandmother's cognitive therapy, like looking at the evidence and all that stuff, yeah, you're right, we're going to lose. But if we can understand and help someone really grasp the process that's happening behind the scenes, that's going to be more powerful. So we do have to talk about the thoughts to that extent. ERP, right, distracting, that is not good. That's avoidance, right? If you want to do exposure, but you're going to try to think about something like avoidance, like distracting, that's one of the worst things you can do. That's a big no-no. That's just maintaining. But ICBT says, like, okay, let's have a different way of thinking about our attention. What if we called it grounding? Grounding in your senses, in your reality, in what's happening right here, right now, in some task or whatever. And that does help direct our attention away from the doubt in our imagination. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Is that necessarily avoidant? Or is that actually what we'd want to be doing anyway, right? So it's sort of a different spin on that piece. ERP, right? The OCD is going to diminish when we confront a core fear, right? Okay, maybe there's like, oh, what if there's germs on there, then what would happen? The core fear is that what's behind that? Oh, if that would happen, if then there's a downward arrow, and then I might start a pandemic. Oh, okay, so that's the core fear. ICBT says, like, no. The issue, the source is not way down here in this chain of events. The source is up here, right here. It's that doubt, that initial doubt that's birthed by inferential confusion, and then that little spark starts the whole fire. And that's how we're going to diminish it, by intervening upstream, not trying to disengage from that original obsessional doubt. Okay? So, I don't expect anyone to click on this, but this is just so you know, I'm not making all this up. There is research behind ICBT and studies that are really kind of burgeoning, and including one that was just published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, I think this week. Most of the research has been done on adults, and there is starting to be some research for youth as well. Okay, and maybe we can talk. I'll just talk through a really quick example. I don't get too much into it, and I'll answer some good questions here. So, there's germs. I don't know. I found this image of the fist to connote sort of violence, unwanted thoughts of harm, and checking locks. These are just typical ones. OCD, as I mentioned earlier, can take on so many different forms and touch on so many different themes. But for example, contamination. What might ERP look like if people haven't done that? Depending on the nature of the presentation, we might have someone, come up with a hierarchy, right? Of, whatever, low, medium, high level of anxiety that different things trigger. And, if we were to touch this, the side of the wall versus like a high traffic area versus the light switch versus the toilet handle, like those are going to be higher, for example, right? And we're going to kind of climb the ladder. We're going to start lower because that's more tolerable. We're still stretching the comfort zone. We're not avoiding. We're doing something intentionally. And as we get used to that, as that gets easier, we're going to kind of start to work our way up. And of course, when we're doing exposure for OCD, it's not just exposure. We're going to be doing response prevention. So that means we got to cut back the washing. We got to wash a normal amount or maybe resist washing at all in a lot of situations. We're going to delay that. We got to cut back the amount of tissue wipes. We got to try to reduce. Some people will do, I wash in multiples of 3 or, 7 times, very arbitrary amount. Can we trim that down to 6 to 5 and so on and so forth? So to the point that you're more closely washing a typical amount, right? That's what exposure, that's a silly, very simple example of what ERP could look like in that case. ICBT, we're going to be educating them. And there's so many sort of worksheets and visuals and things that I can't even get into here to help people understand, like, okay, how did I get from touching a doorknob, by the way, that I probably touch all the time in my own house even maybe, to there's something wrong with the doorknob. What is really happening and what have I actually been doing, perhaps ruminating, avoiding, cleaning? When I'm doing that, what is actually happening? What story is being reinforced? What feared version of who I am or what could happen to me is kind of being given rise to. And, understanding, having language for this. There's inferential confusion. I'm inferring something not based on what I see and what I sense, but based on something up here, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very brief overview. So, okay. Side by side, I think I've beaten that horse enough. Key takeaways, and then I'll get to some questions here. So again, from an ICBT perspective, whether you buy it or not, they say OCD is a disorder of reasoning, an error of inference, a flawed logic process. Not just anxiety. Of course, there's anxiety, but that's secondary, right? ICBT says we're gonna resolve the doubt at the source, up front, upstream, at the point of inferential confusion and the obsessional doubt, rather than downstream. And we're going to learn to trust our senses more, because that's gotten kind of eroded over time to the extent that someone's been dealing with this. Return to the 5 senses, as it says below, rather than kind of getting stuck in our imagination and a feared version of ourselves. Okay. So lastly here, I'll just say in the wise words of the venerable Obi-Wan DeSantis, may the facts be with you. And here is a couple resources if you're interested in learning more. Like I mentioned, Dr. Fred Ardema is the main researcher at this point who's developing and doing the research around OCD. Resolving OCD, Volume 1 and 2. They're pretty thick. They're pretty meaty. I'm not going to lie to you. They're written with the intended audience of both sufferers as well as clinicians to work with sufferers. But it's meaty. There's a lot in there. Mitzen and others were asking about worksheets. There's a lot. That's basically where you'll find them. You can also check out icbt.online. There's a lot of free resources on there, recordings of past seminars, resources, some worksheets. There's a lot of burgeoning free stuff online that you can look at online, but icbt.online is sort of the main hub. And these 2 books, by the way, just came out about a year ago. So they're pretty new. The Doubt Illusion, that one is written more for sufferers, and that's more sort of accessible writing style. There's just a lot of really rich metaphors for illustrating the content of ICBT. That one just came out in October. So relatively speaking, these are pretty new resources. If you're interested to check them out, happy to be a resource if people have follow-up questions. So that's all. Yeah. Couple questions here. How is OCD different from a delusional disorder? Good question. Ooh, how to answer that? Right. So, a number of ways to attack that, Joe. So, I mean, some of us recall that in DSM-4, OCD was categorized under anxiety disorders, and so was post-traumatic stress. And when DSM-5 came out, they sort of OCD and trauma-related things sort of graduated promoted to have their own category. And I think that speaks to both the history that there is a lot of overlap between OCD and anxiety. Obviously, anxiety is a component of features with OCD, but an understanding that there is something different there. But all that to say is, in a delusional disorder, you're less likely to see that type of anxiety and that rumination that you will see when someone is presenting with OCD. With a delusional disorder, there will be sort of more buy-in to whatever thought it is that's intrusive or seemingly illogical to the outside eye. There's probably going to be more of a sense of like detachment and buy into that. A lot of people with OCD will sort of say like, I know it doesn't make any sense. Of course, I would never become a terrorist. Of course, I would never leave my spouse. That doesn't make any sense as a germs on there. Well, what if, right? What if? And that's what keeps the loop going. So it sort of has a different presentation. Having said that, there definitely are sort of more, I would say, in some cases on the more severe end of OCD, there are some people that have been doing this for so long that they're really stuck, and the blending of the sensory and the logical and the imaginary is really, really, really great. And so there can be sort of the diagnostic difference can be great as well.
I remember when I was coming into this. I remember when I was coming into this field, they were switching over from DSM-3 to DSM-4. There was originally obsessive-compulsive disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder.
Right.
Which was the distinction between them essentially is OCD is ego-dystonic and OCPD is egosyntonic, where you think everybody else is crazy. So,
Right. Well,
uh,
and also again, the sort of evolution of these names is a very flawed sort of lineage, because in obsessive compulsive disorder, excuse me, in OCPD as we know it, there's really nothing that could be recognized as obsessions and compulsions. So it's really, these are poorly named disorders that happen to seem similar, but they're really not. Mitson, you asked, is there a pure O presentation of the obsessional sequence? Okay, so for anyone who is not familiar with the term pure O, right, so typically we understood OCD as, compulsions and rituals are tangible, right? Concrete, observable, measurable behavior, the checking locks, hand washing, the disinfecting kind of thing. But over time, people started to recognize that, like, wait, but what if I'm doing it, but it's not visible? What if the mental, I'm counting to 3, or I'm saying something kind of superstitious, or I'm ruminating? That basically ends up serving a very similar sort of function as a tangible compulsion, but no one can see it. So that term evolved called pure O, which is people with OCD that don't have compulsions. It's just obsessions. In effect, as you see what I'm saying, that's not really true. There are compulsions, they're just not visible. They're only mental. And so I would make the case that ICBT, really gives us a lot more rich understanding specifically of the pure O cases, because there aren't tangible, visible, measurable, compulsions to trim back all the time. And this kind of gets at, like I said, someone could be dealing with, pure O, so to speak, ruminating about their relationship, about their sexual identity, about whether life is real. What if we're actually in a video game simulation like The Matrix? These are real presentations. What if something that happened 17? What if a tweet I posted 11 years ago, when I had very different beliefs or didn't know what was right from wrong, or social values have changed, comes out and then I get canceled, right? And I nothing I can do about it. I'm not like double checking things maybe, but I'm just ruminating about it. So there's not a, how to say, I mean, you could make the case that the obsessional sequence still applies in the same way, because there's a doubt, and it's just the compulsion looks a little bit different because it's all internal.
Yeah, I was thinking that this model definitely, for what we call pure O, seems more equipped to deal with that, the internal compulsions.
Right. Let's see, where can I order my Ron DeSantis lightsaber? I don't want to speak for Gampha. Maybe Jim DeSantis lightsabers would be more marketable here. What about Ron DeSantis ones? Probably in Florida somewhere. But do I see OCD as a type of avoidance of deeper issues, trauma? No, actually, really great question. Well, I'll just say that that's a common idea out there, is that OCD is sort of, again, rooted in some sort of childhood trauma or previous adverse experience. That's not mutually exclusive. Someone can certainly, and we have a lot of those people we see that have dealt with significant trauma of multiple types, childhood trauma, sexual trauma, combat trauma, but also present with an OCD-like process. But we all know those things aren't necessarily the same. People can experience trauma and symptoms of PTSD, and it doesn't mean it presents with compulsions in the way that we recognize it as OCD. But certainly we have, I would say most people that present with OCD really don't, report significant prior trauma of some sort of deeper issues. It's kind of an isolated process, but again, not mutually exclusive. It can be a real double whammy. How do you prevent identifying doubt in non-intrusive thoughts? Recognizing the difference between when someone with health OCD needs to go to the doctor and when they do not. Ooh, yeah, good one. Really great question. Gets real gray. There's a lot of different variables, I would say, to that. And there are discussions and debates with all sorts of different cases in our OCD and anxiety, specialist communities, because there's so many variables. Again, I think what I would say is, on one end or the other, is, are there, what's the actual logical sensory information that we have? Is there an actual symptom? Is there a repeated symptom, severity, whatever it is, right? Versus sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, I was sweating and my heart rate went up because I walked up the stairs. What if I'm having a heart attack? Like, okay, and that happens every day when I go up the stairs and I worry I'm having a heart attack, right? you see what I'm saying, is like there's just a number of different pieces that determine when it's grounded in an actual everyday doubt and merits further attention, and when it's merited, when it's not merited because it's purely sort of based in inferential confusion and obsessional doubt. Yeah, it's a great question. It's a complex one. Correlation between autism and OCD. Another great question. I don't want to call it a correlation, but again, people can be dealing with both, or it can be both. People can identify as autistic, and the OCD. Maybe what you're talking about is certain behaviors that can overlap. So, self-stimming behavior that looks repetitive and could look like a compulsion is one thing, but if someone is tapping or doing something that's compulsive, we just want to differentiate what is the mechanism. Is it creating anxiety, or for a lot of neurodivergent folks, if they're dealing with something like that, it's not pathological. It may be something they need to do at times, but they just have to navigate it a little bit differently. Let's see. Should I answer one more question before we get to Mervyn?
Yes.
Okay. Can we give an example working with a patient using ICBT beyond educating? Oh, Martha, how much time do we have here? I wish I could bring you in for one of our case conferences sometime. An example working with, put it this way. I mean, yeah, we're providing the education. You're fair enough, right? Is that going to resolve it all overnight? No, I'm not going to promise that. And look, let me say this too. Obviously we work at a CBT practice. We're talking about inference-based CBT, and we all have different lenses about what that could mean. At the end of the day, we're working with a person here, right? This is not a set of symptoms, and this is not a cookbook formula. I think it's a very powerful model. You can tell that I think it has a lot of merit to it, but how we apply that requires a lot of sensitivity. So, we'll educate. We'll go through the worksheets. We can go through the book. I like to tailor a little bit more rather than going through things linearly. And actually, we're encouraged to do that, even by a lot of leaders in the field, is to draw examples as they apply to the person, and maybe even go off theme, so to speak. So if someone's dealing with contamination, we might try to illustrate the points of the sequence and the language and the wheels by giving them an example that is about, relationship OCD or a real event or a memory that they might be doubting, because it kind of helps them see the selectivity of the doubt in their mind that's only applied to that one context, and expose the double standard. And so they can sort of see the reasoning process happening live and be able to name it, but in a way that's outside of their own sort of, cloud that's very gray and nebulous at that point. So that's probably a much more involved question than I could do justice to. But anyways, other questions, feel free to shoot me an email, everyone, or maybe I'll catch you folks at, follow-up GAMFA events. But thanks for watching.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin Hsia.